Welcome to the deep dive.
Our mission, well, it's pretty straightforward. We take a stack of sources.
A big stack, usually.
Yeah. And we dig through them to pull out the most important, maybe surprising, and relevant insights.
Just for you, think of it as, I guess, your shortcut to being really well informed on a topic.
And hopefully we give you the context, maybe a few, unexpected facts that really stick with you.
So today we're diving into a truly massive work, one that honestly shaped how generations have seen a whole era. Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire.
Specifically Volume 1. We're kind of zooming in on excerpts covering roughly AD 180 to about AD 395.
And this isn't just reciting history, right? It's history seen through the very specific, powerful lens of a classic historian.
A classic and, sometimes controversial historian. We're mostly drawing on Gibbon's own text, where he's weaving together historical accounts and commentary from his time.
Our goal here, well, it's to unpack Gibbon's view of this really tumultuous period. We want to explore the key events, the figures, the trends he highlights.
And also try to understand why his perspective and this whole era, frankly, are still so compelling today.
Get ready for, well, everything. Imperial power struggles, the surprising fragility of the military machine.
Yeah, the very machine it relied on. Plus triumphs of engineering, deep philosophical debates, religious shifts.
And just a fascinating look at human nature under immense pressure and change. Okay, so let's start with the man himself, Gibbon. Understanding his lens is key here, right? He has such a distinct voice.
He absolutely does. And there's this viewpoint mentioned in the sources that history's function isn't always to solve problems, but maybe to transform them.
How do you mean?
Well, you see Gibbon doing that. He takes these past events and frames them in a way that shifts our understanding. It's almost like changing the problem into a different kind of question for us to grapple with.
And a big part of that framing is his tone. It's described as candid and rational, sure, but there's also this undercurrent.
Yeah, this sometimes open, sometimes transparently veiled dislike, as the source puts it, of Christian theology and institutions. That's definitely the controversial bit.
Right. His attitude towards Christianity and Islam, too, it's often chalked up to his hatred of what he saw as excess or maybe fanaticism.
Possibly influenced by his time abroad, his education, French Enlightenment thinking, perhaps. He clearly didn't have much patience for what he deemed popular superstitions.
He even makes this comparison, saying early Christian enthusiasm was viewed by some sober churchmen in the same way they regarded the fanaticism of Islam.
Exactly. He's putting intense religious fervor itself, regardless of the specific creed, into a sort of suspect category from his perspective.
Now, from a modern standpoint, this is where we kind of need to hit pause,
Yeah, definitely. As Gibbon's work is read today, those theological chapters, that specific tone, they aren't just accepted wholesale. The source says, without 1,000 reserves.
No, you really can't just read it straight anymore. Modern historians, they operate from a different place, maybe a more merely historical point of view, as it's put.
And often possess larger tolerances, is a key phrase.
Yeah.
And the text suggests this shift in modern thinking might even make Gibbon's kind of offensive warfare, his sharp critique of religion, feel a bit superfluous today.
Like the arguments have moved on, maybe?
Perhaps. Or the way we discuss religion and history has changed. His polemical edge might not feel as necessary or land the same way, given how educated opinion has evolved.
Okay, so setting aside the tone for a second, what about the actual historical method? How has the study itself advanced since Gibbon's time? He was working with what he had, but...
Oh, massively. Huge progress, especially in source study and text criticism. Gibbon, working back then, sometimes blended his sources, without due criticism.
Meaning?
Well, the example given is he might cite Vigetius, who writ much later, right alongside genuinely earlier writers when talking about Roman military practices.
So potentially projecting later ideas back onto earlier times.
Exactly. Mixing things up without maybe scrutinizing the chronology or reliability of each source quite as rigorously as we'd expect now.
So you need to read Gibbon with that awareness, knowing the texts he relied on have been gone over with a finer-tooth comb since.
Absolutely. Thanks to scholars over the last couple of centuries, names like Mommsen, Peter, Gardhausen are mentioned. We just have much better, more reliable critical editions of the ancient sources.
So a more solid foundation for historians today.
Right. Gibbon gave us this incredible grand narrative, this framework. But the individual bricks he used, we understand them, well, a bit differently now.
Okay, let's pivot to the engine of the empire, the Roman military. It's legendary, right? And Gibbon gives us some the solid numbers.
He does. A standard legion wasn't just Roman citizens. It was about, what, 6,831 Romans? Plus auxiliaries, so the total punch was around 12,500 men per legion.
And under emperors like Hadrian and his successors, this wasn't just for wartime. The peace establishment, the standing army, was substantial.
Yeah, at least 30 legions. That adds up to a permanent force of about 375,000 men.
Wow. And where were they? This is crucial. Not hunkered down in fortified cities.
No, that was seen as a sign of weakness, a refuge, Gibbon calls it. They were encamped right out on the empire's borders, projecting power.
You contrast that with the descriptions of the Germans at the time, say from Tacitus. They lacked learning, arts, established laws.
Lived in scattered huts, not cities. Tacitus says they despised Roman-style buildings as confinement, like prisons.
And despite being famed warriors, their potential threat to Rome was limited.
Right. Gibbon points out their fury was often checked by a lack of consistent arms, unified discipline, and crucially, their own internal divisions. The Roman military machine had organization.
And Gibbon really highlights this. He argues the arts of war defended the empire, preserving a kind of military spirit even when, in his view, other virtues were declining due to luxury and despotism.
But here's the massive paradox, isn't it? This incredible military, designed to protect the empire, increasingly becomes its biggest internal threat. Well, think about the rapid downfall of emperors like Galba, Otho, Vitellius, just before this period started. That taught the armies a very dangerous lesson.
That they were the ones really in charge.
Exactly. They realized they were the creatures of their will and the instruments of their license, as Gibbon puts it. They could make or break emperors.
And we see this play out starkly with Caracalla after he kills his brother Geta. He doesn't exactly win hearts and minds through rhetoric.
No, he just opens the imperial coffers. He takes his father Severus's accumulated treasures and distributes them in one lavish donative.
A massive bribe, basically.
Pretty much. Gibbon uses it to show how quickly loyalty could be bought and how aware the army was of its own power and value.
Which leads directly to military tyranny, even under emperors who were trying to be, decent.
Like Alexander Severus. Gibbon tells that tragic story of Ulpian, his praetorian prefect, basically his chief minister and head of the guard.
A wise administrator, apparently.
Yeah, but he tried to rein in the army's intolerable disorders. And the soldiers, they just massacred him right at the emperor's feet. They saw anyone trying to impose discipline as an enemy.
So attempts at reform were incredibly risky. Probus, a successful general himself, tried to restore discipline after his victories.
And Gibbon suggests that very attempt contributed to his own death. Again, at the hands of his soldiers. They didn't want discipline, they wanted license and rewards.
This constant threat, then, leads to a really fundamental change under Constantine.
Right, he'd seen it all. Nearly 100 rebellions from Commodus to his time, often led by powerful military governors. So to secure his own throne, he makes a huge structural shift.
He separates military and civil power.
Exactly. He takes military command away from the provincial governors and the old praetorian prefects who had these regional power bases.
And gives it to new officers.
To masters general of cavalry and infantry. These guys answered more directly to him and didn't have that independent territorial authority. It was a deliberate move to centralize control and break that dangerous link between regional command and imperial ambition.
Okay, so the military is this powerful, unpredictable force. Let's focus on the imperial throne itself during this incredibly turbulent century or so, from around 180 to 305 AD.
Gibbon starts by looking back, actually, to Augustus, the founder. He points out how cunning Augustus was, reigning under the old republican titles, consul, tribune.
But gathering all the real power.
Precisely. And he notes how the titles themselves evolved. Augustus became the specific personal title for the monarch, while Caesar settled into being the title for the heir, the second in command, really standardized around Hadrian's time.
Then we hit Commodus, who comes right after that period of the 5 good emperors. And Gibbon does not paint a flattering picture.
No. Weak, timid, easily corrupted by his inner circle. And his cruelty wasn't strategic or calculated. Gibbon says it grew into a ruling passion, just cruelty for its own sake.
He inherits a war, but ducks out, preferring Rome's luxuries. And after he's assassinated, the Senate formally condemns his memory.
Brands it with eternal infamy, yeah. A strong statement. And his death really opens the floodgates for a century of instability.
Leading to figures like Septimius Severus.
A very different character. Shrewd, ruthless when necessary. Gibbon calls him a master of deception, There's that famous story he recounts.
The one about Albinus.
Yeah. Severus calls his rival Albinus the brother of his soul and empire in this letter, while at the exact same time he's sending assassins to kill him.
A brutal lesson in trusting political rivals.
Definitely. Then comes Severus's son, Caracalla, even more infamous, known especially for murdering his own brother Geta.
Gibbon describes his reign as just brutal. He notes Caracalla admired Alexander the Great, right? Even formed a special Macedonian phalanx guard.
He did.
Yeah.
But then Gibbon delivers that classic sharp jab. Caracalla only resembled Alexander in the murder of a great number of his own and of his father's friends.
Ouch. That's specific and damning.
Very Gibbon. And Caracalla's brutality catches up with him eventually, stabbed by a disgruntled soldier near Carrhae.
But then the army steps in again.
Yeah, the soldiers, remembering his partial liberality, those payouts, they actually force the Senate to deify him, make him a god.
It shows where the real power lay, not with the Senate, not with tradition, but with the legions.
Absolutely. And Maximin, who follows later, is a perfect example. He rises from the ranks, a soldier emperor. His cruelty initially hits the senators, but his avarice, that hits everyone.
Because he needs money for the troops.
Constantly. So he confiscates city revenues, melts down temple offerings, even statues of gods and previous emperors.
That's beyond just bad governance. That's attacking the sacred.
And Gibbon stresses that. This sacrilege caused huge tumults, even pushed a whole province into open rebellion. While Gibbon concedes Maximin had military skill, he also hints that the descriptions of his savage features might be a bit exaggerated by political enemies. Party bias, he calls it.
Okay, is there any respite in this period?
There's a brief glimmer with Gordian III, a young emperor guided by his capable praetorian prefect and father-in-law, Misitheus.
Gibbon describes Misitheus as a man of letters.
Yeah, an intellectual who surprisingly turns out to be a skilled military leader. He wins victories against the Persians, handles army logistics effectively. A rare combination.
But it doesn't last.
No. Misitheus dies, possibly poisoned, which opens the door for Philip the Arab, who then conspires against the young Gordian. And this kicks off what Gibbon calls 20 years of shame and misfortune.
From Philip to Gallienus.
Right, just a relentless period of barbarian invasions, constant civil wars between rival general emperors. It's chaos.
And Gibbon himself admits it's hard to write about.
Yeah, he notes the confusion of the times and the scarcity of authentic memorials. The historical record itself reflects breakdown.
A particularly low point must be Emperor Valerian's capture.
Profound humiliation for Rome, captured by the Persian king Sapor. Gibbon repeats the story, maybe apocryphal, but telling of Sapor using Valerian as a human footstool when mounting his horse.
And after Valerian's death,
his skin was supposedly stuffed and kept as a trophy in a Persian temple. A truly brutal symbol of Rome's vulnerability and the emperor's degradation.
After this, things start to turn around a bit, with Claudius Gothicus.
He rises through the ranks. Gibbon points out this interesting letter from the previous emperor, Gallienus, showing Gallienus was suspicious of Claudius's ambition, even while needing his military talent. Claudius then earns his nickname Gothicus for major victories against the Goths.
And then Aurelian achieves something pretty remarkable.
He does. Restores universal peace and order, Gibbon says, in just over 3 years, a whirlwind of campaigns.
Gibbon describes his triumph in Rome vividly.
Oh yeah, a massive spectacle. Exotic animals, elephants, tigers, giraffes, even a rhino, gladiators, immense wealth, ambassadors from distant lands, captives from numerous nations.
Including 10 martial heroines of the Gothic nation. Quite a specific detail.
It really paints a picture of the empire pulling itself back together, at least temporarily.
Then Probus, another soldier emperor. Gibbon says he let the Senate handle civil administration.
Yes, but adds that Probus secretly despised their indolence and weakness. They had long since been excluded from military command and had just acquiesced.
Probus was vigilant, but still faced rebellions.
Couldn't be everywhere at once. And Gibbon uses a rebelling general, Saturninus, to voice the personal cost to power. Saturninus apparently lamented the misery of sovereign power, this constant fear, distrusting everyone, even your guards, your friends, living with perpetual envy.
It sounds exhausting, frankly.
Right. Then this section rounds off with Carinus, son of Emperor Carus. And Gibbon paints him as just spectacularly awful.
Vicious.
Infamous for his vices. Married and divorced 9 wives in months, pursued irregular appetites, hated anyone who reminded him of his humble background, persecuted old schoolmates.
Filled his court with sycophants and
Singers, dancers, prostitutes, yeah. Gave top jobs to his low-born cronies, like making his doorkeeper the governor of Rome.
And his spectacles were just pure excess.
Gibbon contrasts them with earlier, perhaps more purposeful displays. Carinus apparently staged these huge hunts in the Circus Maximus, bringing in entire forests, collections of rare animals, zebras, elks, hyenas, tigers. Gibbon dryly notes that displaying elephants in the Punic Wars had a military point. Carinus's displays were just showing off.
And this cost him loyalty.
Absolutely. He's eventually killed during battle against his rival Diocletian, killed by one of his own officers, a tribune whose wife Carinus had apparently seduced.
And Diocletian takes the throne.
Yes, and goes on to defeat Persia, setting the stage for a new, more autocratic phase of the empire.
So looking back at this whole chaotic stretch from Commodus to Diocletian, what's the big takeaway Gibbon wants us to see?
It feels like he's showing a system teetering on the brink. You have the administrative machinery, yes, it's still there. But the combination of deeply flawed emperors, cruel, incompetent, debauched, and this incredibly powerful, entitled military creates a devastating cycle.
It's not just bad luck with emperors.
No, it's a structural vulnerability. The immense power vested in one man, coupled with the army's ability to dictate who that man is, leads to constant violence, instability, and ultimately weakens the empire from within, even as external threats are mounting.
Okay, let's move into the next major phase, focusing on Constantine, a figure who just profoundly reshapes the empire. And of course, the rise of Christianity becomes central here.
Constantine's background is fascinating in itself. Son of Constantius Chlorus and Helena. Gibbon describes Helena as the daughter of an innkeeper, later divorced by Constantius for political reasons.
Constantine himself comes up through the military, served in Egypt, Persia.
Had to make a daring escape from the court of Galerius, who was jealous and likely planned to get rid of him. Gibbon paints him as physically imposing, tall, majestic, but also intrepid, prudent, and deeply ambitious.
His path to sole power involved multiple civil wars, didn't it?
Yes, first against Maxentius in the West. Gibbon depicts Maxentius as rather fearful, superstitious, consulting the Sibylline books before the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, where he's defeated and killed.
And Maxentius was apparently hated by the Roman people anyway.
Which certainly helped Constantine's cause. Then he has to deal with Licinius, the emperor in the East.
Another civil war.
Right. Gibbon notes Constantine often won key battles despite having smaller forces, suggesting superior generalship or troop morale.
When Licinius finally sued for peace, Constantine laid down strict terms.
Absolutely. Demanded the removal and execution of Valens, who Licinius had appointed as his Caesar, his junior emperor. The peace treaty effectively divided the empire again, but gave Constantine huge new territories in Europe.
And the appointment of Caesars reflected this power shift.
Yeah, sons of both emperors were made Caesars, but it was clear Constantine held the upper hand. It solidified his dominance before the final conflict with Licinius later on.
Then comes this absolutely monumental decision, building a new capital.
The Second Rome. He chooses Byzantium, renaming it Constantinople. It's interesting, Gibbon mentions he briefly considered the site of ancient Troy first.
A nod to Rome's mythical origins.
Exactly. But Byzantium was strategically brilliant. He builds it on a massive scale. Huge walls, public buildings galore, a capital, a circus, theaters, baths, forums, granaries, aqueducts.
Senate halls, churches, palaces. Thousands of houses.
Yeah, it grows incredibly fast, designed from the start to rival, maybe even surpass, old Rome.
And he actively populates it, right? It wasn't just organic growth.
No, very deliberate. He invites even commands, senators, and wealthy families from the provinces to move there. He grants them lands, pensions, titles. Gibbon even says he alienated state lands elsewhere to incentivize building in Constantinople, a massive state-sponsored project.
Now, Constantine's relationship with Christianity, this is a huge focus for Gibbon, and it's complicated.
Gibbon portrays his conversion as gradual, maybe even incomplete until his deathbed baptism. He suggests Constantine proceeded cautiously, not wanting to abruptly overturn the traditional religious fabric of the empire.
His public actions seem to reflect that balancing act.
Definitely. Gibbon points out that his ministers sometimes used ambiguous language about the emperor's beliefs, and Constantine himself publicly mixed pagan and Christian practices.
Like the Sunday Edict.
Right. Issuing an edict promoting the observance of Sunday, which had Christian associations. In the same year, he directs the regular consultation of the aruspices.
Who were pagan diviners, so keeping a foot in both camps, publicly at least.
Exactly. Gibbon describes Christianity's spread during his reign not as a sudden revolution, but flowing with a gentle, though accelerated motion. Facilitated, but not forced initially.
During this period, we also see the Christian church itself developing a much more significant structure.
Yeah, Gibbon traces some of that. The Church of Jerusalem was the earliest, led by bishops who were circumcised Jews, initially blending Mosaic law and Christian doctrine. It held a kind of primordial authority.
But its influence faded.
As large churches grew in the major cities, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, power shifted. Authority moved from purely local congregations towards regional councils of bishops.
And the bishops themselves gained more power.
Absolutely. They moved from exhortation to command. They started forming alliances, claiming their authority came directly from God. They were the vice-regents of Christ, the successors of the apostles.
This gave them control over clergy appointments, too.
Right. They asserted the exclusive right to ordain priests and deacons, which limited the influence of local congregations in choosing their leaders. They demanded implicit obedience, and any resistance from lower clergy was quickly labeled faction and schism.
Gibbon singles out figures like Cyprian of Carthage
as being particularly skilled at advancing this episcopal power, blending, as Gibbon sees it, genuine Christian virtues with astute statesmanship to consolidate the authority of the bishops.
and the church started accumulating wealth.
Gibbon suggests the accusations were likely true. He mentions gold and silver vessels being used in services, converts selling property to donate sometimes, he notes pointedly, at the expense of their unfortunate children.
He gives concrete examples.
Yeah, the Bishop of Carthage collecting a large sum, like 850 pounds sterling, for captives. The Roman Church receiving a huge donation of 200,000 sesterces. There were early laws, kind of like medieval mortmain laws.
Restricting land ownership by institutions.
Exactly, preventing churches from acquiring too much land without imperial permission. But Gibbon suggests these were often evaded. By the late 3rd century, churches in major cities definitely held considerable estates.
So the church is becoming a powerful institution in its own right, organizationally and financially.
While this is happening, Gibbon argues, paganism was already weakening intellectually. He suggests figures like Cicero and Lucian centuries earlier had already exposed its folly. Skepticism was spreading among the educated,
Philosophers might pay lip service in public.
but privately held it in contempt. And this doubt trickled down. The intellectual foundations of traditional paganism were, in Gibbon's view, already crumbling.
Which brings us to the persecutions of Christians. Gibbon poses that question. Why were Christians targeted, but generally not Jews?
His argument hinges on how they were perceived. Jews were seen, rightly or wrongly, as a distinct nation following their ancient ancestral laws.
Right.
It might be peculiar, but it was traditional. Christians, however, were seen as something new, a sect.
Breaking away from tradition.
Exactly, breaking the sacred ties of custom, abandoning the gods of their ancestors, the gods of Rome, the gods of, as the Romans saw it, all mankind. That abandonment of ancestral religion was viewed as deeply offensive, almost unnatural.
And the Christian attitude towards martyrdom baffled the Romans.
Completely. Gibbon describes the Romans viewing it as obstinate despair of stupid insensibility or of superstitious frenzy. He quotes that exasperated proconsul. If you are thus weary of your lives, is it so difficult for you to find ropes and precipices?
Almost sarcastic disbelief.
And Gibbon does concede that some Christians did seem to actively seek out martyrdom. But interestingly, he also notes the flip side. The courage of the martyrs could sometimes inspire onlookers and even lead to conversions.
What about Nero's persecution? That's the famous early one.
Confirmed by Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. Gibbon observes Tacitus likely wrote about it later, based on reading and hearsay, not as an eyewitness.
And Gibbon offers a potential explanation for Nero targeting Christians.
He suggests Nero desperately needed scapegoats after the Great Fire of Rome. The Jews, he argues, might have had powerful protectors at court, like Nero's wife Poppaea, helping divert blame.
He also raises a point about terminology, the label Galileans.
Yeah, he wonders if Tacitus might have mistakenly conflated Jesus' followers with the more politically troublesome zealots led by Judas the Gaulonite, unfairly tarring the Christians with the zealots' reputation for sedition.
And Gibbon suggests this Neronian persecution was mainly localized.
Primarily confined to Rome, he thinks, and maybe less about specific religious beliefs and more about finding someone to blame for the fire.
He also questions the overall severity of later persecutions, suggesting some church historians might have exaggerated the numbers.
He does. He points to Eusebius, a major church historian, who himself reports relatively small numbers of martyrs in Palestine during the Decian persecution, just 10 men and 7 women.
And Eusebius' own language about mass martyrdoms.
Gibbon finds it sometimes cautious or ambiguous. especially when talking about huge numbers in places like Thebes, hinting that maybe Eusebius wasn't always reporting first-hand accounts for those larger figures.
He uses Cyprian of Carthage again as an example.
Right. Cyprian was a hugely prominent bishop, certainly a target.
Yeah.
But when things got dangerous, he strategically retreated and survived. Gibbon uses this to suggest the danger, while undeniably real, wasn't perhaps the constant, inescapable inferno sometimes depicted. Certainly, he implies, less statistically dangerous than being a Roman emperor in that era.
Okay, so alongside all this political and religious change, the philosophical landscape is shifting too. Gibbon discusses Neoplatonism, which becomes really influential.
Yes, rising primarily out of Alexandria, superseding the older Athenian schools. Thinkers like Plotinus were incredibly profound, but Gibbon has a critical take.
He thinks they corrupted the human understanding. How?
By neglecting, in his view, practical and scientific knowledge in favor of intense metaphysical speculation. Exploring the invisible world, trying to forcibly reconcile Plato and Aristotle on topics Gibbon felt they actually knew little about.
And this philosophical exploration kind of morphed into something else.
He suggests it did. They started claiming special abilities, disengaging the soul from the body, interacting directly with spirits. Philosophy, in Gibbon's critique, edges into a form of magic. He mentions theurgy, specifically.
Theurgy.
Yeah, a complex system involving rituals aimed at influencing gods or spirits. And significantly, these Neoplatonists became staunch defenders of traditional pagan superstition, trying to justify myths through elaborate allegory, while also becoming fierce critics of Christianity.
Meanwhile, within Christianity itself, huge debates are raging, especially about the nature of God, the Trinity.
Absolutely. Gibbon outlines the major competing views, trying to make sense of God as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit.
He lays out three main emblems from this period.
Right. First, there's the view associated with Arianism. They saw the Son, the Logos, as created by the Father, made out of nothing, existing before all worlds, yes, but still having a beginning. There had been a time, as the phrase went, when he was not.
So the Son wasn't co-eternal with the Father.
Exactly. He governs under the Father, almost like Gibbon suggests, a Caesar serving under an emperor. This view effectively degraded the Son's status relative to the Father.
Okay, what's the second view?
This is the one that eventually becomes the orthodox position, codified at the Council of Nicaea. It posits three distinct, infinite minds or substances, Father, Son, Spirit, who are co-equal and co-eternal, together composing the one divine essence.
And their unity lies in their perfect harmony.
Perfect, concord, and will, yes. Gibbon tries to explain the key term consubstantial homoousorgion using the analogy of three men sharing the same human nature, but immediately qualifies it, stressing the unique spiritual connection and the Father's preeminence to avoid suggesting three separate gods.
Tricky concept. And the third view?
Sabellianism. This view basically confounded the persons. It saw Father, Son, and Spirit not as distinct entities, but more like different modes, roles, or manifestations of the one single Godhead.
So this view essentially annihilated the distinct personhood of the Son and Spirit.
That's Gibbon's assessment, yes. It preserved God's unity, but at the cost of distinct persons.
The Council of Nicaea, then, presided over by Constantine himself, had to navigate these positions. The key term was consubstantial, homoousion.
Right. Gibbon describes the orthodox position that emerged as this delicate balance, a tremulous ball, he calls it, caught between the Arian view that degraded the Son and the Sabellian view that annihilated the distinct persons.
Though degrading the Son was seen as the bigger error.
It was treated much more severely, yes. Arianism became the major heresy fought against for decades.
A central figure in this fight was Athanasius of Alexandria.
Hugely important. Gibbon acknowledges his genius and his firmness. He famously resisted Emperor Constantine's attempts to force him to reinstate Arius. That shows some real backbone, the church leadership pushing back against the emperor.
Athanasius faced a lot of opposition himself, though. Accusations, synods.
Oh, yes. Accused of everything from treason to sacrilege to murder. He often prudently avoided attending councils stacked with his enemies. Gibbon notes his unwavering opposition to the Arians, but also adds this fascinating detail.
What's that?
That for years, Athanasius actually defended Marcellus of Ancera, who leaned heavily towards Sabellianism. Only later did Athanasius apparently acknowledge Marcellus's venial errors with an ambiguous smile.
Suggests the lines weren't always perfectly clear-cut. Or maybe political alliances played a role.
It certainly hints at the complexity of the theological and political landscape, even among those considered broadly orthodox.
Gibbon also touches on earlier Christian groups, predating these big Trinitarian fights, like the Ebionites.
Right, Jewish Christians who kept Mosaic law but also followed Christ. They saw Jesus primarily as a human prophet, endowed with divine power, fulfilling prophecies, but they rejected the idea of a divine pre-existent logos or son.
And on the other extreme, the Gnostics, or Docetes.
They swung the other way, heavily influenced by Greek philosophy, especially Plato's idea that matter is inherently flawed or evil. They believed Christ was purely divine and only appeared to have a human body like a phantom.
Because a perfect celestial being couldn't possibly inhabit imperfect matter.
That was their logic, yeah. So Gibbon uses these examples to show that even in its earlier stages, Christianity wasn't monolithic. It was a diverse, intellectually vibrant, and often quite contentious movement, grappling with really fundamental questions.
Okay, finally, let's touch on Julian, the emperor often called the apostate, a really fascinating figure who reigned for just a few short years, around 361 to 363.
His backstory is pretty dramatic. He and his half-brother Gallus were basically the only male relatives of Constantine the Great left alive after a major family massacre following Constantine's death.
That must have left a mark.
You'd think so. Julian was eventually made Caesar, junior emperor, and sent to Gaul by his cousin, the Emperor Constantius II.
He had some tough experiences there.
Yeah, faced serious military challenges. Gibbon mentions an ambush where 2 legions were wiped out, teaching Julian, as he puts it, caution and vigilance. He had some successes, but Gibbon suggests he chafed under Constantius's control.
What really set Julian apart, though, was his intellectual life and his religious devotion.
Absolutely. He immersed himself in philosophy, especially Neoplatonism. He was deeply influenced by figures like Maximus of Ephesus, who was a master of theurgy, that philosophical magic aiming to influence the divine.
Julian wasn't just an academic student, though.
No, he practiced it. Gibbon recounts his secret initiation rites into pagan mysteries, first at Ephesus, then the famous Eleusinian mysteries near Athens. This wasn't just policy, it was a sincere, deep, and unalterable enthusiasm for the pagan gods. He reportedly spent hours every night in private devotion.
And when he became emperor, he made restoring paganism his central mission.
Openly. Gibbon describes how Julian cleverly used public occasions, like military festivals, to promote paganism. He'd blend the symbols, military standards, imperial majesty, and pagan ritual.
Like requiring soldiers to toss incense on an altar when they received their pay?
Exactly. A really shrewd move.
Hmm.
It put Christian soldiers in a difficult spot. Publicly conform, compromising their faith, or risk identifying themselves as dissenters.
Gibbon notes this policy was expensive.
Hugely. Enacted at the expense of sums which would have purchased the service of half the nations of Scythia, Gibbon writes dramatically, but it served a purpose beyond just piety.
Securing the army's loyalty.
And also, Gibbon suggests, fleshing out the pretended Christians, those who had maybe converted under Constantine and Constantius, purely for political advantage. Julian wanted genuine pagan devotion.
Julian also seemed concerned about justifying his own rise to power, his usurpation against Constantius.
Yeah, Gibbon says Julian felt the reproach of ingratitude towards Constantius, who had, after all, made him Caesar. So he tries to justify his actions not just with military force, but with arguments.
He published Constantius's secret letters.
Yes, trying to expose Constantius's alleged plots against him. And he wrote this detailed apology addressed to the Senate and people of Athens, framing it like he was submitting his case to a respected philosophical jury.
Seeking legitimacy from multiple sources.
Military success, philosophical justification, traditional Roman validation from the Senate. He was trying to shore up his controversial position and his radical religious policy on all fronts. A complex, driven, and ultimately short-lived reign.
Wow. Okay, what a journey through this section of Gibbon. We've covered so much ground power shifts, the military's shifting role, engineering, philosophy, religion.
And the sheer human drama of it all. Leadership, belief, betrayal, ambition, all viewed through Gibbon's very specific, very sharp perspective.
We've seen that Roman military machine evolve from the empire's guardian into, well, often its biggest internal problem, the kingmakers.
Yeah, and the emperors themselves. Such wild swings from relatively cautious leaders to outright cruel tyrants, pleasure seekers, then back to disciplined soldier emperors.
And we traced the really complex, sometimes quite surprising, early history of the Christian church, its internal debates, its growing structure and wealth, its fraught relationship with the state and pagan thought.
And always we have to remember Gibbon's own voice, his Enlightenment skepticism, his biases, shaping how this entire story was told and understood for generations.
So, stepping back from all these fascinating details in the excerpts, What does this deep dive into Gibbon's volume I really show us? What's the bigger picture here for you, the listener?
Well, I think it powerfully underscores that history isn't just a list of facts and dates. It's this incredibly complex interplay of human nature, institutions, ideas, and pure chance.
And it's always, always filtered through the lens of the person telling the story. Gibbon isn't just reporting events, he's constructing an argument about why they happened and what they meant.
Recognizing that lens is crucial.
Definitely. And that leads us to maybe a final thought for you to chew on. Gibbon shows us an empire capable of incredible feats: administration, law, those amazing public works, that formidable military potential.
Yet, despite all that underlying structure and strength,
How is it possible for personal failings, an emperor's vices, a general's ambition, the army's greed to repeatedly throw the whole system into such chaos?
what does that fragility tell us about the real foundations of power? Is it the institutions? Or is it something more elusive, like loyalty, character, maybe even just luck, both then and perhaps now too?
Something to think about. Keep digging, keep questioning. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.